My mother stole my college fund to have her fourth wedding, so I took my revenge at her ceremony and she ended up getting arrested the same day. I lost my grandmother when I was 18. She was a strong and direct woman who ran her own upholstery business for 5 decades and raised 3 children, with my mother being the middle one. They often clashed, and when I was young, I used to see my grandmother and mother fighting over small things, wondering why, until I realized that my grandmother hated my mother because of me. To provide some context, according to my aunt, my parents never really loved me. They held resentment towards me from the moment I arrived in the world. During the first 6 months of my life, I lived with them and my grandmother. However, as I began to grow, my grandmother forced my parents to take responsibility for me. I remember that my parents called me various derogatory names, especially my father, like Bimbo and Dumbo, which was very painful to hear. Curiously, despite this, I turned out to be the most academically gifted among my cousins, thanks though to my parents' encouragement. From a young age, I developed a passion for pursuing a career in sciences. My parents used to beat me for reasons that seemed trivial, like wearing nail polish or talking to a boy. My father never let me wear makeup. He disapproved of my tight clothes, even if they were just yoga pants with a long t-shirt, basically anything associated with being a girl. I was still growing, and their controlling nature affected me deeply. When my parents fought, it always seemed like somehow it was my fault. On top of all this, my mother constantly complained that I didn't contribute around the house. The reality was that from a very young age, they taught me to help. I folded at least 2 loads of laundry every day, cleaned one of the bathrooms daily, washed the dishes, and took care of various other chores like sweeping the floors. Despite all this, I never uttered a complaint about it, and yet my parents never appreciated it. I felt like trash in their home. Back then, I used to do most of the things my parents told me and avoided anything they didn't mention. I stayed away from drinking, kept myself away from drugs, and made sure not to wear clothes they considered provocative. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to go out with friends, not even for birthdays, and they couldn't come to our house. There were times I made up excuses to stay longer at school during the day because I enjoyed spending time with others outside the confines of my home. Everything changed when my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even though I had always hated him for trying to control my life, I still didn't want him to die. However, my mother clearly thought otherwise. She left my father, saying she didn't want to be with a sick husband. My father and I were both in shock when we saw her packing her things and leaving. Later, my father broke down sitting on the porch. Although I was only 14, I could understand his pain. I always saw him sitting there, taking a beer when he had a bad day. So when I heard him crying, I brought him a beer from the refrigerator. My father started sobbing as he realized that I was trying to comfort him in the only way I knew how. From that day on, I don't know how or why, but everything changed between him and me. He was no longer rude or abusive to me. I would even go as far as to say he was a good father after my mother left. In the following weeks, my parents divorced, which was easy since my father had a prenuptial agreement with her and she couldn't collect any alimony. By the following month, my mother had moved in with her new boyfriend, who apparently was her high school sweetheart, Morty. During this time, my mother resented having me every weekend. Whenever my father dropped me off with her, she invented excuses about why she couldn't see me that weekend. It really hurt because I felt that my mother had divorced me along with my father. Through all this, my grandmother continued to visit us and my cousins once a month for a sleepover at her house, which remains one of my favorite memories to this day, 5 months after my parents' divorce. Of course, my mom remarried. Morty bought a house for my mother, hoping that they could start a family together. However, my mom had other plans. Whenever I visited, which was rare, I always found her on her phone laughing and talking to someone, seemingly carefree, only cutting the call when it was time for Morty to come home. Apparently, Morty eventually found out that she had been cheating on him with another guy, and they had a huge fight. However, my mother managed to convince him it was just a one-time mistake, so they stayed together. During this time, my father's health wasn't improving. In his last days, he spent as much time with me as he could. I returned home from school terrified, thinking something had happened to him. Unfortunately, one night, my father passed away in his sleep after months of chemotherapy that didn't work. My grandmother and my father's family were the first to reach me since I simply couldn't stop crying. When my mother arrived, she was alone, with no trace of Morty. I didn't know at the time, but my mom had continued talking to the other guy behind Morty's back and had finally left him. At my dad's funeral, my mom kept saying how my dad's death couldn't have come at a worse time since she was already dealing with a lot. Everyone was so shocked and irritated by her lack of sensitivity when my dad's will was revealed. It stated that all his assets would pass directly to me. My mother seemed very interested in jumping back into my life, but my grandmother didn't want me to live with her as she knew what kind of daughter she had raised. She knew that my mother wanted me for the money my dad had left for me. My grandmother and aunt helped me sell all of my father's assets to open a college trust fund in my name. However, since I was still a minor, my mother's name also had to be added. Meanwhile, Morty, my mother's husband, divorced her during this period, and since they didn't have a prenuptial agreement, she ended up with a substantial settlement. Because of this, my grandmother warned her not to touch my funds, emphasizing that she already had her own money. My mother agreed to this arrangement when me and my mom started living together. At first, I felt like I was living with a stranger. She had changed so much over the years, and not for the better at all. All she did was act like a teenager. She would get dressed up and go out every night, returning home late with strange men and bringing them to her room. Every morning, I would enter the kitchen and notice someone different. It became a daily routine. When I turned 16, my mom introduced me to her third husband, Joy. From the start, it was clear he didn't like me. His behavior towards me was cruel and unnecessarily critical. Every time I raised the issue with my mother, she would confront him, which led to even more belligerence covertly behind each other's back. Then, when my brother arrived 10 months later, my mother's narrative changed to portray Joy as a good person inside. She apparently struggled to express it, and I was encouraged not to resent him, but to be more understanding. However, Joy had no problem showing love to my little brother, Brad. Curiously, my mom confided in me several times that she had nothing in common with Joy, but had married him because he would provide us with a stable family. This was far from the truth because my mother and I would have ugly fights, especially after Brad was born. I started to scream if my mother spent time with me and not with Brad, telling me things like she wished I had died with my dad, or that I should go live with my grandmother because she wanted her son to receive all the love and attention. It was painful and mentally exhausting to live with him, where I clearly wasn't welcomed. Every time I begged or questioned my mother about why she stayed with him, she skillfully changed the subject. One day, my mother and I were left with my grandmother so they could go hang out with mutual friends and have some fun. This initially started as once or twice a month, but evolved into almost every weekend. Usually, they asked me to take care of Brad while they were out, but that night I was studying for my exam, so they left both of us at my grandmother's house. I loved spending time with her, and she usually cooked really delicious meals for me while I could study in peace. Brad was playing with his toys on the living room floor. My grandmother had strictly told my parents they should be back by 11 to pick us up. However, even after 11, my parents had still not returned. I started to worry since I had exams the next day and needed to put Brad to bed on time, or he would scream. Meanwhile, my grandmother kept calling and leaving angry messages for my parents. At midnight, Joy and my mom finally showed up in their car completely drunk and laughing like teenagers. They smelled like alcohol, and it surprised me that they even managed to drive here without getting caught. I went to pick up Brad while my mother asked me to gather my things so we could drive back. However, my grandmother stood her ground and yelled at them for showing up so late and so drunk, which was dangerous for all of us. She told Joy he couldn't take his son in that state and that we should call an Uber and leave the car at their place. However, Joy started to argue with my grandmother, telling her to mind her own business and that he was the father, so he knew what was best for his son. Tensions quickly escalated with heated exchanges of curses between my grandmother and Joy. My mom stayed on the sidelines, saying nothing, clearly drunk and unable to process anything. I could feel the tension rising, so I pleaded with them to stop, reminding them they were scaring my brother. But my words fell on deaf ears. The shouting persisted, and Joy started throwing insults at my grandmother and me, saying how he had never liked us but tolerated us for my mother. This infuriated my grandmother even more, and in a fit of frustration, she threatened to call the police. Upon hearing this, Joy, clearly drunk and yelling like a maniac, did the worst thing I've ever seen someone do. He slapped my grandmother. I screamed in horror when Joy's hand struck my grandmother's face, the sound echoing in the room. "Stop! Just stop!" I yelled, but Joy didn't even look at me while Brad started crying, clearly traumatized. My grandmother, holding her cheek, shouted at me to call the police while my mother watched in horror. I barely remember what I told the 911 operator as I was crying too much, but luckily the person understood and stayed on the line with me until the police arrived. When Joy noticed the sirens approaching, panic crossed his face, and suddenly he began begging my grandmother with desperation in his eyes, pleading with her not to press charges, insisting it would ruin his life and my mother's. Eventually, I came to discover that Joy was arrested for assault and taken away in handcuffs. He kept begging my mother to help him post bail, but my mom, who had been frozen up until then, started crying and shouting at him. My grandmother made it clear to my mother that if she didn't divorce that man, she would involve Child Protective Services and my mother would lose her 2 children. My mother just nodded, clearly terrified. Only later did I find out that Joy and my mother had also been doing drugs that night along with alcohol. The reason she was not arrested that evening was that she was mostly quiet, unlike Joy. That night, Brad and I stayed at my grandmother's because I refused to be alone with my mom while I was so disappointed and traumatized. Fortunately, the next day when my mother came to her senses, she realized what her husband did, filed for divorce, and prohibited him from seeing us again. When the rest of the family found out what he had done, they all turned against my mother, and rightly so. They were appalled, especially since she had waited so long to act and did not see the signs earlier. My aunt and uncle yelled at my mother until she started crying. They were so angry, they promised never to speak to her again because of what her husband did. According to the charges against Joy, since it was the first time he committed a crime, the court sentenced him to probation. During this period, Joy had to attend therapy and was ordered to stay away from us. He could only see his son if my mother allowed it, and she had to be present too. He tried to beg my mother for forgiveness, but she ignored him and divorced him. She got a lot from him in the settlement, and since then, she's been living a good life. I didn't want to stay with my mom after the incident with Joy, so I took all my things to my grandmother's house while Brad stayed with my mom. My mother didn't like this arrangement at all since she depended on me to take care of my brother, but couldn't say anything out of fear that my grandmother would scold her. This year, I celebrated my 18th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult and start a new chapter in my life. However, life had other plans for me. My grandmother passed away just 1 week following my birthday unexpectedly from a heart attack, as she had no heart problems at all. After her funeral, the entire family was in shock. I discovered that she had drafted a will to divide her assets between me and my aunt. She divided her jewelry and valuable antiques equally, for my eldest son, my uncle, would inherit the car he always loved. For my cousins, she divided her money to be deposited in their college trust funds. Lucas got her most significant asset, her house, simply because I was the closest to her and had been living with her. She didn't want me to go back to my mom's home ever again. I was shocked and started to cry tears of joy since her house meant a lot of happy memories for me. Unfortunately, my grandmother left nothing for Brad. I don't know if she forgot or perhaps it was because Brad was just my half-brother. Needless to say, my mom was furious with my grandmother, outright stating that leaving a house to me was worth so much more than her jewelry, and it just wasn't fair that her mother left me so much. No one else but my mother had any complaints since everyone understood my grandma had left us with meaningful things we all deserved. Then my mother got angry because Brad received nothing and started to speak poorly about my grandmother, calling her selfish for not doing anything for her son. I grew upset and told her that she should be thankful her mom decided to leave her something after what her ex-husband had done. Upon hearing this, my mother got mad, saying that I had no right to bring up the past, which caused me to mock her. She then started telling me I should sell my grandmother's house and move in with her. I told her that I loved staying in the house and would never sell it because it meant more to me than money. My mother tried pressing me further, but I stood my ground. I have to say it has been wonderful living on my own. I've always been surrounded by toxic people until I moved permanently into my grandmother's house and had never lived alone before. However, I have been spending a lot of time by myself and going to therapy to deal with my grandmother's death. With everything that's going on in my life, I decided to take a gap year. However, as I was no longer a minor, I wanted to remove my mother from my trust fund. I needed her signature to access the funds and also to eliminate her as a beneficiary. So, I went to speak to my mother 2 months ago, and she introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robbie, whom she had been dating for weeks. Robbie seemed like a nice guy, although quite a bit younger than her. Unlike all her ex-husbands, I knew better than to mention his age. I requested my mother to talk privately and she agreed. I hoped things would go well regarding my trust fund because that was legitimately the money my dad had left me. But my mother began to panic when she heard I wanted to remove her from the trust. She said no, insisting that I was too young and that I didn't need to take her out since I wasn't going to college that year anyway. Her behavior began arousing my suspicion, but my mother kept insisting I could always come to her when I started college. Later, I spent some time with Brad and ended up leaving. It was only when I was driving back home that I realized there was a chance that my mother was using my money from the funds. Although it seemed unlikely at the moment, I decided to consult a lawyer who could help me understand the terms and conditions of the trust document. The lawyer reviewed it, and he agreed my mother needed to sign for me to access the funds. However, I was able to check its current value, if necessary. That's how I discovered from the bank what my mother had been doing. Not only had she been withdrawing money from the college fund in small amounts over the years, but after our recent conversation, she had completely emptied the account. I was horrified. It felt as if the ground had collapsed beneath my feet. The betrayal was too much. I was so mad over what my mother had done. I cried and wandered around the house for days. It was no surprise she didn't want me to remove her access to my funds, as she knew that if I confronted her about it, she would just deny it or come up with some absurd excuse. I felt I needed to teach her a lesson. Just as luck would have it, my mother, who had no idea that I knew about her betrayal, called to inform me that she was getting married again. She went on excitedly about how Robbie was definitely the one. This is funny because it was already her 4th wedding and nearly made me roll my eyes since this was the same thing I had heard from her about every guy. She told me how she was going to have a big wedding to celebrate her love with Robbie. I just wanted to yell at her and scold her for being such a wicked mother and for stealing my money. But I kept my mouth shut because I wanted my revenge. Since she was going to have a wedding, it presented the perfect opportunity for me to make a plan. I decided to have a family meeting to bring together all my trusted cousins and relatives for what I was about to do. I shared everything with them and showed them documents about how my mother had been withdrawing money from my college trust fund, a fund that held all the money my father had left me, and how she had completely emptied it when she realized she wouldn't have access to it anymore. Upon sharing this, the family's disbelief mirrored mine when I first discovered the truth. I told them that the timing of her wedding seemed suspicious and how she likely had stolen my money to fund her lavish wedding, and I wanted to humiliate her at this event before she got arrested. My uncles were horrified that my mother could stoop so low and promised to back me up. My cousins agreed with my plan as well. My mother's wedding took place last week. She invited the entire family to her church wedding and the big reception with Robbie. I decided to attend the wedding wearing a t-shirt that said, "My mother is a gold digger," in bright red letters. I had this shirt made especially for the occasion. Upon seeing my attire, Robbie and his family looked shocked while I simply smiled politely and walked to claim my seat. My side of the family was already aware of my plan, so they were prepared. When my mother, unaware of my plans, began walking towards the altar, I remained seated. She didn't even look at me as she passed by, so it appeared that my plan was working. During the ceremony, when the priest asked if anyone objected to the union, I knew it was my moment. I raised my hand to signal an objection. The priest looked surprised. However, along with me, my aunt, uncle, and cousins also raised their hands. My mother and Robbie looked at us horrified as I stood up from my seat. My mother finally realized the words on my t-shirt, and her face turned crimson with shame in front of the assembled guests. I accused my mother publicly of stealing money from my college fund, holding documents revealing the details of her betrayal, emphasizing how she had robbed my funds from my deceased father, leaving me without the means to go to college. Her face drained of color while whispers spread among the guests. I then asked aloud why she would steal money from her own daughter when she had already been married 3 times and had received more than enough alimony from her 2 previous marriages. The room filled with sighs when Roby turned to my mother, clearly oblivious to her actions, asking why she had only mentioned having been married once to him. My mother glared at me with anger and began shouting at me how childish I was and how she hadn't stolen any of my money, for she had every right to that money since she was married to my father. She told me I should be grateful she gave birth to me. I yelled back that what she had done was illegal, and I would make sure she got arrested for it. However, my mother scoffed and called me ungrateful, insisting it wasn't a big deal since she had practically raised me, and the least I could do was let her have the money, arguing that she had every right over it. It was then Joy chimed in, asking my mother if that was why they managed to afford such an extravagant wedding, because my mother was using my money. Momentarily stunned, my mother went silent, which was essentially an admission. Then all hell broke loose. I couldn't contain my anger and began shouting at her. Chaos escalated as my relatives joined in, telling her how despicable her behavior was. Amid the shouts, my mother countered insistently it was a private matter between her and me, and they shouldn't judge her for it. Things got physical as my aunt got too close while confronting her, which led to shoving between them. The chaos peaked, and eventually, someone called the police. Before long, my mother was arrested because she was still screaming when the police arrived and was refusing to calm down. I went to the precinct with my aunt to make my statement. Since then, my mother has been charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I can't believe it. Even as I write this, I never expected to get my mother arrested. I can't believe she did this to me. Ever since the wedding, I've been receiving calls from everyone, both out of concern and indignation. Some of my distant relatives think I went too far, that I should never have involved others in this matter or gotten my mother arrested. My side of the family believes I did the right thing. Regardless, this circumstance is so extraordinary, and I do question if I went too far with my mother. Update 1. Thank you all for the kind words. When this happened, I was overthinking everything and really felt guilty because I never hated my mom, or at least didn't until she stole from me. I never wanted to sue her and still feel like I'm in a nightmare right now. However, I understand. All of this is the consequences of her own actions. To all of those worried about me, please don't. My uncle helped me find a good lawyer who is confident we will win this case against my mom. My only goal is to get back my lost money, or at least as much of it as I can. As for those wondering about Brad, he is fine. He's still too young to understand what is currently happening, and he is staying with Joy and his family since my mother's arrest. As for Roby, I assume he won't marry her after all this. Update 2. It has been 2 months since my last update, and I know many of you have been wondering what happened, so I'd like to clarify that I wasn't allowed to speak or write anything about the case while the legal proceedings were ongoing. In summary, the court ruled in my favor. My mother has been ordered to repay every penny of the money she stole from my college fund. She cried and pleaded, but the judge didn't relent. Now she has to liquidate all her assets and likely sell her house to pay me back. It feels so good to write this as these last months have been brutal on my mental health. The only thing that kept me going was thinking about my grandma and dad. My grandma would be proud of me for standing up to my mom. My dad would have wanted me to recover my money to invest in my future. Update 3. 3 months have passed since my last update. How was everyone's new year? Mine was fantastic. My mother, facing the consequences of her actions, has returned the full amount she had embezzled from my college trust fund. The legal process forced her to undo her errors, at least financially. Also, I made the hard decision to cut all ties with my mother permanently. The rest of the family shared this sentiment and collectively decided to distance themselves from her, despite her attempting to reach out to us as if we should just forgive and forget this incident. Lately, I've been reviewing brochures and thinking about how 2024 will look for me. The gap year has turned out to be fantastic overall. Despite the legal proceedings, it has been a mix of self-knowledge and healing from past traumas. Spending time with my cousins and other family members has always been a significant part of moving forward. Update 4. I'm not sure if it's surprising or not, but my mother has decided to marry again. This will be her 5th victim, but to be fair, it will be her 4th marriage since Robbie dodged a bullet thanks to my revenge. It's clear I won't be invited because I already ruined a wedding for her once, and she's not going to risk that again. But I know many other family members won't go either, firstly because they don't want to have anything to do with her, and secondly because it doesn't make much sense, as she will likely have another husband like usual in a few years. I must add that I have started college and plan to study medicine. I know it's tough, but I enjoy helping people and will do everything to succeed.